The most effective way to destroy a person is to convince them that what happened to them never really happened. Let's get something straight before anyone gets uncomfortable. Because this isn't going to be one of those soft, vague, feel-good conversations where everything is blamed on misunderstandings and everyone walks away morally clean. What was done to you wasn't accidental, and it definitely wasn't harmless. It was targeted, repeated, and intelligently disguised. And yes, that's the part that should make people uneasy. Here's a fact most people don't like to sit with. Prolonged exposure to injustice rewires the brain faster than trauma itself. Neuroscience shows that when someone is consistently blamed, isolated, or punished for reacting to harm, the brain doesn't just store pain, it stores patterns. That's why you didn't just feel hurt back then. You became hyper-aware, emotionally precise, and sharp in ways that can't be taught in classrooms. Funny how the very environment designed to break you quietly trained you instead. And let's add a little humor before this gets too heavy. Because if you don't laugh at some of it, you'll realize how ridiculous the gaslighting actually was. Imagine being treated like a threat, a problem, and a liability, while minding your business, trying to survive, and barely asking for anything. That's not villain origin story energy. That's someone else projecting their unfinished business onto you and calling it discipline. This topic isn't about exaggeration. It's about exposure, about naming what people desperately wanted you to normalize. Because what happened wasn't just unfair, it was methodical. It followed patterns, the kind of patterns you only see clearly once you stop blaming yourself for being affected by them. And that's where things shift. Because once you recognize that you weren't too sensitive, too much, or hard to deal with, the entire story flips. What looked like chaos starts looking coordinated. What felt personal starts looking structural. And suddenly the sickness you felt wasn't weakness at all. It was your intuition rejecting something deeply wrong. So, no, this isn't a pity party. It's a post-mortem. A calm, clear breakdown of what was done, why it was done, and why it never actually worked, no matter how much effort went into convincing you otherwise. Number 1. They didn't attack you because you were weak. They attacked you because you were ungovernable. From the very beginning, there was something about you that didn't fit neatly into their boxes. You didn't absorb instructions the way others did. You didn't fully surrender your inner voice, even when you were scared, young, dependent, or unsure. You might have complied on the surface, but internally, something in you stayed alert. That quiet alertness is what made you a problem. Not loud rebellion, not arrogance, just an inability to be fully owned. Ungovernable people don't need to be confident to be threatening. You didn't need power or status. All you needed was the instinct to think for yourself, to notice inconsistencies, to feel when something was off. That alone disrupts systems that rely on obedience without understanding. So instead of being guided, you were pressured. Instead of being supported, you were scrutinized. They weren't reacting to what you did. They were reacting to what you couldn't be turned into. That's why the treatment felt excessive, why the punishment didn't match the situation, why small mistakes were handled like major offenses. They were trying to locate your breaking point, the moment you'd finally hand over your inner authority and just go along. But it never quite happened. You bent, but you didn't collapse. And that frustrated them more than open defiance ever could. What's disturbing is how early this starts for people like you. Long before you had language for it, you were being corrected not for bad behavior, but for independent perception. You were subtly trained to doubt your instincts, to explain yourself too much, to shrink your reactions so others could feel comfortable. That wasn't guidance. It was conditioning. And here's the part that hits later in life. The very traits they tried to suppress are the ones that make you hard to manipulate now. Your awareness, your discernment, your refusal to fully internalize false narratives. They didn't fail because they weren't persistent. They failed because ungovernable people can be pressured, but they can't be rewritten. Number 2, what they did wasn't discipline, correction, or love. It was containment. They weren't trying to teach you right from wrong. They were trying to limit how far you could go. That's why the rules kept changing. One day you were fine. The next day you were too much. One day you were praised. The next day you were watched. Real discipline is consistent and clear. What you experienced was selective pressure, designed to keep you within a narrow emotional and psychological range. Containment works by shrinking possibility. You weren't corrected to grow, you were corrected to hesitate, to second-guess yourself, to pause before speaking, choosing or trusting your own judgment. Every time you showed curiosity, confidence, or emotional depth, there was a subtle pushback, a look, a comment, a punishment that felt out of proportion. Over time, you learned that expansion came with consequences. That's how containment hides. It pretends to be concern. It dresses up as for your own good. But real care doesn't make you smaller. Real guidance doesn't make you afraid of your own thoughts. What they called love felt heavy because it was restrictive. It required you to stay manageable, predictable, and easy to handle. You were allowed to exist, but only within limits, they decided. Too confident made them uncomfortable. Too quiet made them suspicious. Too expressive made you a problem. So you were constantly adjusting yourself just to stay safe. That's not growth, that's survival. And the cruel part is that containment doesn't look violent. It looks orderly. It looks reasonable to outsiders. People watching from a distance might even say you were lucky. They didn't see how much of yourself you were swallowing just to avoid conflict. They didn't see how much energy went into staying acceptable. That's why it felt exhausting just being you. You weren't tired because life was hard. You were tired because you were being compressed, forced to fold parts of yourself that didn't naturally fold. Over time, that creates frustration, self-doubt, and a quiet grief for the version of you that never got space to fully breathe. What they underestimated is that containment can delay growth, but it can't eliminate it. Once you're out of that environment, expansion happens fast. The moment the pressure lifts, you realize how much was held back, and that's when it becomes clear. They weren't shaping you. They were holding you down. Number 3, you were treated like a problem because you exposed their unresolved guilt just by existing. You didn't have to say anything or do anything outrageous to trigger it. Your presence alone was enough. Something about you quietly reminded them of choices they never made, growth they avoided, and responsibilities they dodged. You became a walking mirror they never agreed to look into, and instead of facing what they saw, they turned the mirror into the problem. That's why the reactions never made sense. Why you were blamed for moods you didn't create. Why tension followed you into rooms where you were minding your business. People carrying unresolved guilt don't respond logically. They respond defensively. And guilt hates exposure. It hates clarity. It especially hates someone who doesn't play along with denial. You noticed things. You asked questions that weren't meant to shame but still did. You held standards they had quietly lowered for themselves. Even your silence could feel accusing to someone who knows they cut corners in life. So rather than take responsibility, they made you the disturbance. If they could label you difficult, sensitive, or problematic, they wouldn't have to confront the discomfort you stirred up in them. This is why the criticism felt personal but vague. You were accused without clear evidence, corrected without clear instruction, judged without a fair trial. The issue was never your behavior. It was the way your existence poked holes in the story they told themselves about who they were. And here's the part that takes time to see. They needed you to be flawed so they could feel justified. If you were wrong, they were safe. If you were unstable, they were normal. If you were the issue, their conscience could rest. So they kept pressing on your weak spots, hoping you'd eventually internalize the blame and carry it for them. That's a heavy burden to place on someone, especially when they're still forming their sense of self. You learned to over-explain, to apologize for things you didn't do, to constantly check whether you were at fault. Not because you were guilty, but because guilt was being outsourced onto you. Once you see this clearly, something shifts. You stop arguing with accusations that were never about you. You stop trying to prove your worth to people who needed you small to feel okay. And the weight lifts, not because they changed, but because you finally put the guilt back where it belonged. Number 4, they studied you closely, not to protect you, but to exploit your patterns. Every reaction you had, every instinct you followed, every way you tried to process the world was being observed. They weren't curious out of care or concern. They were mapping you. They wanted to know what made you anxious, what made you hopeful, what could make you break or bend. Every detail of your personality became data to be used against you. The way you flinched at criticism, the moments you hesitated, the rare moments you felt truly safe. All of it was noted, catalogued, and weaponized. It wasn't always obvious at the time. Some of it was subtle. A comment here, a sigh there, a shift in tone that left you second-guessing yourself. Other times it was bold and deliberate, meant to test your limits. They were learning exactly how far they could push before you resisted, exactly how much confusion you could tolerate, and exactly which triggers could make you doubt yourself. That's why the pain often felt precise. It wasn't random cruelty, it was strategy. And the scary part is how unconscious it often felt on your side. You were living in their experiments without realizing it, navigating an environment built to predict your every move. Their goal wasn't your growth, your safety, or even your betterment. It was control. Knowing your patterns meant they could manipulate outcomes, shape your decisions, and influence how you viewed yourself. They treated your mind like a blueprint, your emotions like tools, and your instincts like weaknesses to be exploited. Yet the irony is that all this observation didn't erase you. It didn't make you predictable, controllable, or compliant. What it did was sharpen you. The constant pressure refined your awareness. You started noticing inconsistencies, sensing motives, and reading situations others overlooked. The very effort to manipulate you built a kind of armor you couldn't have developed any other way. In the end, studying you so intensely didn't give them the control they wanted. It only made you harder to deceive. Every pattern they thought they understood became a marker of resilience. They didn't break you. They unknowingly built the kind of precision in you that would make their manipulation useless. Number 5. They isolated you so your reality would be easier to rewrite. Isolation wasn't just about keeping you alone. It was about controlling the story you heard about yourself. When people are cut off from support, feedback, and honest mirrors, their sense of reality becomes fragile. That fragility is exactly what made you easier to influence. Without consistent voices to confirm what you felt and saw, doubt crept in quietly. You started questioning things that once felt obvious, not because you were wrong, but because you were outnumbered. They limited who you could talk to, what you could say, and how much of yourself you could reveal. Sometimes it was direct, other times it was subtle, discouraging certain friendships, creating tension with people who cared about you, or framing outsiders as unsafe or untrustworthy. The goal was the same either way: reduce the number of perspectives you had access to. When your world gets smaller, the loudest voice in the room becomes the truth, even when it's distorted. Isolation also made your emotions easier to dismiss. Without witnesses, your experiences became easier to deny. You were told you were overreacting, misremembering, or taking things the wrong way. And because you didn't have anyone consistently saying, "No, that's not okay," you slowly began negotiating with those narratives. You learned to rationalize harm just to survive it. What makes this especially damaging is how it trains self-doubt into your nervous system. You didn't just feel lonely, you felt uncertain. You hesitated before trusting your instincts. You replayed conversations in your head, wondering if you imagined the tension or the cruelty. That kind of mental looping doesn't come from weakness. It comes from being denied validation for too long. And yet, isolation has an unintended consequence. When external noise is stripped away, internal awareness grows. You were forced to spend time with your thoughts, your feelings, your inner world. Even in confusion, something in you kept track of the truth. A quiet part of you remembered what felt wrong, even when you couldn't explain why. That's why, once you reconnected with others or found language for your experiences, clarity came fast. The rewritten reality couldn't hold up under honest reflection. Isolation delayed your understanding, but it didn't erase it. The truth didn't disappear. It waited. Number 6. They punished you for reacting to harm instead of acknowledging the harm itself. From the start, it wasn't what happened to you that mattered. It was how you responded to it. Every time you showed anger, sadness, frustration, or even quiet disappointment, the focus shifted onto you. Your emotions became the problem, not the actions that caused them. That's why it often felt like you were being punished for being human. Because in a way, you were. You were punished for having the courage to feel, for having instincts that screamed something wasn't right. The cruelty of this is subtle, but devastating. If someone spills coffee on your lap, you expect irritation. If someone betrays your trust, you expect hurt. But when the response becomes the target, the original harm vanishes in the narrative. They didn't have to face their actions. You became the evidence of wrongdoing. Your body's natural signals, your mind's alert system, your attempt to process trauma, all of that was reframed as the problem. Over time, it teaches a person to question their own reactions, to distrust their instincts, and to apologize for feelings they never asked for. This pattern also trains hypervigilance. You start monitoring yourself constantly, calculating how to respond so that you aren't wrong in someone else's eyes. The natural flow of emotion becomes dangerous. Spontaneity is replaced by self-censorship. Your nervous system starts treating natural responses like liabilities. Yet there's a hidden strength buried in this injustice. Because your reactions were unfairly targeted, you became acutely aware of emotional manipulation. You started noticing when guilt was being assigned incorrectly, when blame was being shifted, and when harm was being disguised as concern. You learned to separate cause from effect, harm from reaction, and reality from projection. The truth is that punishing someone for responding to pain is a desperate move by people who cannot face accountability. They may have thought it would break you. Instead, it honed your perception. You began recognizing the mechanics of injustice in ways few ever do. The very thing they tried to shame in you, your reaction to harm, became the compass that would guide you toward clarity and independence. Number 7. They deliberately confused love with survival so you'd mistake pain for connection. What they did wasn't random neglect or absent-mindedness. It was a carefully orchestrated mix of attention and withdrawal, warmth and coldness, praise and punishment. Affection came inconsistently, approval was given sparingly, and safety felt conditional. The result was that you learned early on to equate the bare minimum of care with love. You started measuring relationships by survival, not by nourishment. Every time you felt relief, even for a moment, Your system coded it as reward, even when harm followed immediately after. This confusion rewires how you understand connection. Pain and discomfort became signals to pay attention rather than warnings to escape. You learned to tolerate emotional instability, thinking it was part of normal love. Moments of kindness were amplified in your memory, while the repeated injuries were minimized because your body and mind were trying to make sense of a chaotic system. Over time, the line between safety and threat blurred. You began to accept what should have been unacceptable because survival required it. They did this because predictable compliance isn't enough. It's the emotional roller coaster that ensures control. By alternating care and cruelty, they trained you to chase approval and constantly negotiate the terms of your own safety. You weren't just responding to actions. You were responding to a system designed to make you dependent on its rules, even when those rules were harmful. And yet, the effect of this manipulation has a hidden lesson. It teaches vigilance and discernment. Once you step out of that environment, you begin to notice patterns that others miss. How people's behavior fluctuates when power is involved, when control is disguised as care, when emotional currency is being spent strategically. You start to understand that love is not conditional, not inconsistent, and not something that comes with strings attached. The irony is that what was meant to confuse and weaken you became a foundation for clarity. The false connection, the manipulation disguised as love, sharpened your instincts. It taught you to recognize genuine care and distinguish it from calculated survival. And that awareness becomes one of the most valuable tools you carry forward, long after the chaos has ended. Number 8. They wanted you hyper-aware of their moods but disconnected from your own. From early on, you were trained to monitor everyone else's emotions as if they were the only ones that mattered. A raised eyebrow, a sigh, a subtle shift in tone. You learned to notice it all, to anticipate reactions, and to adjust yourself accordingly. The unspoken rule was simple. Keep them comfortable, keep the peace, and never let your own feelings get in the way. Your instincts, your needs, your discomfort, all of it became secondary, invisible, something to suppress. This kind of conditioning is exhausting because it flips the natural order of awareness. Normally, a person learns to navigate the world by balancing their own feelings with others, understanding boundaries, and asserting needs when necessary. In your case, you were hyper-tuned to everyone else while your own internal signals were ignored, dismissed, or punished. Over time, that disconnection creates a strange emptiness. You know what everyone else needs, wants, or feels, but you lose track of what you even want yourself. The irony is that this hyper-awareness is also a form of control. By keeping you attuned to their moods, they ensured you were always reacting to them rather than acting from your own sense of self. You became predictable in your responses, while still thinking you were autonomous. Your energy was consumed managing their emotional landscape, leaving little left to explore your own thoughts, desires, or boundaries. Yet, there's a hidden edge to this. Because you were forced to observe so carefully, your perception of human behavior became acute. You notice micro-expressions, subtle intentions, and inconsistencies that others miss. You learn to read people in ways that feel instinctual now, but back then, it was survival. The very skill they honed for their control became your tool for discernment. Once you reconnect with your own feelings, reclaim your instincts, and listen to your internal compass, you realize just how much clarity they never anticipated. They wanted a person who reacted perfectly to their moods. Instead, they unknowingly created someone who can now read, anticipate, and understand human behavior, including manipulation, with extraordinary precision. Number 9, they used authority to justify cruelty so you doubt your moral compass. Authority is supposed to guide, to set boundaries that make sense, to provide structure. What you experienced wasn't guidance, it was a weapon. They leaned on their age, status, knowledge, or position to make their actions unquestionable. Because they had power in some form, their cruelty was framed as necessary, justified, or even deserved. And the effect on you was devastating. You started doubting your own sense of right and wrong. If the person who should know says it's okay, how could it feel wrong? Every punishment, correction, or unfair expectation was disguised as moral instruction. You were taught that compliance equaled righteousness, and resistance equaled sin or error. That conditioning runs deep because it hijacks the simplest measure of self-trust, your instincts. You start asking yourself, am I overreacting? Am I too sensitive? Maybe they're right and I'm wrong, even when your gut knows the truth. Authority, in this context, isn't a tool for guidance. It's a mirror that reflects back someone else's distorted version of reality and forces you to question your own. The danger is subtle, but constant. You're not just reacting to unfair treatment, you're constantly negotiating between what you feel is right and what you're told is right. That creates a kind of internal tension that leaves you perpetually second-guessing yourself. You apologize for things you didn't do, you rationalize actions that hurt you, and you internalize blame for events outside your control. All because the person wielding authority framed their cruelty as proper, unavoidable, or just. The remarkable part is what emerges after this conditioning is challenged. Once you start observing actions without filtering them through the lens of authority, clarity hits like a shock wave. You realize that morality isn't granted by someone's title or position. It's rooted in truth, integrity, and accountability, qualities they lacked while trying to rewrite yours. And in that moment, you reclaim the compass they tried to steal, seeing clearly who was manipulating, who was hiding behind power, and what your own moral code really looks like. Authority loses its leverage the second you stop measuring your world by their warped rules. Number 10. They underestimated what prolonged injustice does to perception. When you live under constant unfairness, it changes the way you see the world. What might look like chaos or randomness to others is clear pattern to you. You notice subtle inconsistencies in behavior, hidden motives in words, and unspoken rules in actions. Prolonged injustice sharpens perception in ways few experience. They thought repeating harm would confuse you, break you, or make you compliant. Instead, it trained your mind to detect irregularities that most people never even notice. Every time an action didn't match the explanation, every time punishment was given without reason, every time loyalty was demanded while respect was denied, it was a lesson in subtle truth. You were learning the mechanics of manipulation without even realizing it. You started identifying patterns, predicting responses, and seeing motives that remained invisible to those blinded by comfort or naivety. That kind of awareness isn't born from privilege or intelligence alone. It's forged in the furnace of repeated injustice. The irony is that they thought constant pressure would reduce your clarity, but it amplified it. Pain became a teacher, observation became instinct, and confusion became discernment. You were forced to measure people by actions rather than words, to interpret behavior without the filter of their explanations, and to trust the instincts they tried to suppress. In a world where most people accept appearances at face value, your perception became a weapon of understanding. What they didn't account for is the subtlety of this transformation. It doesn't make you loud, obvious, or confrontational. It makes you vigilant, precise, and incredibly difficult to deceive. The same environment they built to control you created someone who sees beyond manipulation, someone who can identify truth in chaos, and someone whose instincts are finely tuned to detect dishonesty. In the end, their efforts to confuse and dominate became the very thing that armed you. Prolonged injustice didn't break you the way they expected. It refined your perception, giving you insight into human behavior that most people spend a lifetime trying to understand. They underestimated you because they couldn't imagine that survival under their control could sharpen clarity rather than dull it. Number 11. They tried to delay your becoming, not realizing delay creates depth. Every block, every obstacle, every unfair restriction was meant to slow you down, to keep you from realizing your full potential on their timeline. They wanted you paused, waiting, uncertain, and frustrated. They wanted your growth postponed so that you would remain manageable, controllable, and above all, predictable. They didn't see the irony. The very thing meant to stunt you was quietly building layers of strength, patience, and awareness that could never have formed without resistance. When your progress was delayed, you were forced to sit with yourself, to learn endurance in ways speed never allows. Waiting became a teacher. Frustration became a mentor. Every closed door, every discouragement, every not yet wasn't just an obstacle. It was a period of silent refinement. They thought you were being held back. The truth is, delay gave you something no advantage or privilege could: internal architecture. You learned how to hold yourself together when external forces were chaotic. You learned how to observe, assess, and adjust without losing sight of your purpose. In that space of waiting, clarity develops. You start understanding people, motives, and systems in a way that goes deeper than surface-level ambition or early success ever could. You see patterns in behavior, traps in decisions, and weaknesses in strategies that others overlook because they've never had to pause long enough to notice. Delay doesn't just teach patience. It cultivates perception, resilience, and the ability to move deliberately rather than react impulsively. What they underestimated is that delayed growth doesn't disappear. It compounds. Every period of frustration, every moment of being blocked, secretly prepared you for a level of depth and power that isn't accessible to those who move too quickly. By trying to slow you down, they shaped someone capable of timing, precision, and wisdom that can't be rushed. The version of yourself they wanted to suppress emerges stronger, steadier, and far more aware than they ever imagined, proving that delay doesn't destroy potential, it enhances it. Number 12. They expected you to internalize blame forever, and that's where they miscalculated. For as long as you can remember, blame was never yours to avoid. Every conflict, every mistake, every moment of discomfort in their lives somehow landed squarely on your shoulders. You were taught to apologize for things you didn't do, to over-explain yourself, and to negotiate your existence in ways that felt exhausting and unfair. The subtle, relentless pressure wasn't just about control. It was about training you to carry guilt that never belonged to you, as if your conscience were their ledger and your mistakes were their safety net. But here's the thing they didn't count on. Blame can be deferred, questioned, and ultimately rejected. No matter how deeply they tried to root it in you, there comes a moment when something clicks. You stop asking, "What did I do wrong?" and start observing, "What was done to me?" That shift is invisible to them, but it's seismic. Once the lens flips, every accusation, every punishment, every unfair expectation is seen clearly for what it was: projection, manipulation, and an attempt to maintain power. They wanted you small, uncertain, and self-policing. Instead, the exact pressure they applied trained you to discern truth from fiction, reality from narrative. Their strategy relied on your internalization of guilt, but it underestimated your capacity to separate yourself from the lies forced upon you. The more they tried to make you carry responsibility for their dysfunction, the stronger your awareness became. You began to see patterns in behavior, recognize manipulation, and reclaim authority over your own experience. And when that realization lands, the liberation is profound. You understand that guilt is not a default setting, and blame is not a permanent inheritance. You start carrying accountability for your own actions, not theirs, and that clarity transforms every interaction, every choice, and every relationship moving forward. They expected compliance. What they got was emergence. The very tool they thought would enslave your spirit became the instrument of your freedom, proving that internalizing blame forever was never an option they could enforce. Number 13. Your healing threatens them more than your success ever could. They feared your rise, but they feared your recovery even more. Success can be dismissed, rationalized, or envied. It's tangible and can be measured, compared, or undermined. Healing, on the other hand, is invisible until it becomes undeniable. It changes the energy around you. It reshapes your presence. It removes the chaos they relied on to maintain control. When you heal, the imbalance they depended on collapses, leaving no excuses, no justifications, no easy way to maintain their authority over you. Healing isn't just about feeling better. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself they tried to silence, erase, or manipulate. It's about aligning your body, mind, and emotions so that you no longer react according to their scripts. They thought they could keep you uncertain, scared, or self-doubting, but healing undermines that framework entirely. Every defensive move they made, every manipulation, every guilt imposed, starts to lose its power because your foundation no longer shakes. This is why some people respond to your healing with confusion, irritation, or even hostility. They can't admit that you are no longer within their sphere of influence. Your emotional independence exposes truths they wanted buried and behaviors they hoped you'd normalize. It threatens the narrative they've carefully constructed about you, about themselves, and about the world they try to control. When you heal fully, their attempts to diminish you don't work anymore, and that terrifies them more than your accomplishments ever could. Healing is a quiet but revolutionary act. It doesn't announce itself with trophies or titles, but it signals strength that can't be negotiated or silenced. It shows that their influence has limits, and that control has boundaries they can't cross. And the more you embrace it, the more impossible it becomes for them to manipulate your reality. Healing is your reclaiming of sovereignty, your refusal to be defined by past harm, and the ultimate disruption to the control they tried so hard to maintain. Your peace becomes their mirror, reflecting the very dysfunction they spent so long hiding. Number 14. They targeted you because something in you survives truth, and truth is uncontrollable. What they feared wasn't your strength, your intelligence, or even your compliance. What terrified them was your ability to see clearly, to feel accurately, and to hold on to reality no matter how twisted the circumstances became. Truth doesn't bow to pressure, logic, or authority. It exists independently, and you carried it within you in ways they could neither predict nor suppress. That's why their attacks were so relentless, because you were never fully aligned with their version of reality. You survived it, and surviving truth is something that cannot be caged, silenced, or edited. They tried to manipulate the story, rewrite events, and frame your perceptions as flawed, but truth has a stubborn persistence. It quietly resists distortion and waits for the right moment to surface. Every injustice they inflicted, every lie they told, and every boundary they violated only revealed how clearly you could perceive the difference between what was real and what was fabricated. Your clarity became an irritant to them. They couldn't tolerate a person who could endure chaos without letting it redefine them. Being a carrier of truth also makes you unpredictable, and unpredictability is frightening to those who rely on control. You couldn't be fully read, fully manipulated, or fully defeated because you operated according to principles they could not dictate. They attempted containment, punishment, and suppression, yet each attempt revealed the very quality they sought to erase. The deeper their attacks, the more visible your resilience became. Eventually, what they tried to destroy becomes your power. Surviving truth equips you with discernment, authority over your own perception, and the courage to confront lies, whether they come from others or from yourself. That quality cannot be bought, bargained for, or coerced. And that is why they targeted you with such intensity. Not for weakness, not for compliance, but because the part of you that survives truth is uncontrollable. It cannot be broken. It cannot be silenced. It simply exists, waiting to align your life with reality, clarity, and uncompromising sovereignty, no matter how hard they tried to erase it. All of this leads to one undeniable truth. What was done to you wasn't a reflection of your weakness or your worth. Every manipulation, every restriction, every lie and betrayal was a mirror of their own fears, insecurities, and failures. They targeted you not because you deserved it, not because you were flawed, but because something in you was untouchable, a core they could never control, a truth they could never rewrite. They studied you, pressured you, isolated you, and tried to bend your reality to fit theirs. They attacked your responses, blurred your understanding of love, and hid your instincts from you. But all of that only sharpened your perception, strengthened your intuition, and built an internal foundation of resilience that no cruelty could dismantle. What they underestimated is that suffering, when endured consciously and survived, doesn't break you. It teaches you. It cultivates patience, discernment, awareness, and sovereignty. Every delay, every injustice, every attempt to rewrite your story became part of the blueprint for your awakening. The very traits they tried to suppress, clarity, awareness, persistence, and truth, became the instruments of your liberation. You didn't just survive their targeting. You transformed it into insight, strength, and power. You became someone who sees beyond deception, someone who carries truth unapologetically, someone whose presence is impossible to manipulate. This is more than recovery. It's reclamation. It's proof that no system, no manipulation, and no attempt at control can undo what exists within you naturally: integrity, awareness, and the capacity to rise above. Your experiences, as painful and unfair as they were never the end of the story. They were the crucible that forged the version of you that cannot be diminished, cannot be silenced, and cannot be bent to anyone else's will. If this resonates with you, if you see yourself in these truths and feel the weight of what you've survived, let this moment be a turning point. Share your journey in the comments. Encourage others by letting them know they're not alone, and help spread this message by liking and sharing this video. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss insights that shine light on truths the world would rather keep hidden. You survived, you grew, and your clarity is a gift, and it deserves to be seen. Stay awakened, chosen ones.